Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully we can continue the energy from the class session, fueled by coffee. We have our presenters, David Rainbow, Adrienne, Edgar, and our discussant, Okay, so in a number of ways, the paper that I submitted is an attempt to address some of the questions that have been posed earlier. So in particular, Eric posed the question, in the first panel, how are these concepts of race kind of actionable, or how do they get things done, I think he put it. My paper is in part an attempt to try to address that question. In the second panel, Eric posed the question, what are the mechanisms that allow for a kind of racial transformation to take place? So if we're going to consider the extent to which race is, simultaneously or in some otherwise mystical fashion, both immutable and a kind of malleable category, what are the mechanisms by which people conceive of race as a transformative, kind of having a transformative potential? So the way that I do this is by considering the role of race in the thought and writing of a number of Siberian intellectuals from the 1850s to the first decade of the 20th century. In particular, I focus on a group of intellectuals who came to call themselves Siberian regionalists. They had an abiding interest and conviction in seeing Siberia become an autonomous and, to one extent or another, depending on who you talk to and when, a self-governing or at least self-administering territory, and with a few moments of wanting independence and the creation of a United States of Siberia. So this was kind of this is what united this group of Siberian intellectuals, was this aspiration toward autonomy. My paper looks at their mobilization of the racial, or the concept of race, as a means to achieving that end. So I start with the premise that I derive from how I read their own writing, that their real goal was to gain Siberian autonomy. Race comes along, this is sort of my crude summary of it. Race comes along as a part of this discourse that we've been hearing about from the late 18th century on. And in the 1860s, one particular prominent Siberian intellectual, Chapa, takes this concept of race and writes a couple of articles that are very critical of how, as he puts it, racial degeneration is happening in Siberia. By this he means that Russians who have been settling Siberia since its acquisition in the 16th century had gone native, right? Willard Sunderland writes about this as well. That there was this kind of anxiety over going native and Russians degenerating into the form of the inarodцы rather than the reverse, which was the tacit assumption that settling this population was going to civilize in a gruesome way. The next kind of generation of Siberian regionalists take up this idea that Chapa is the first to articulate in the Siberian context, and start to repeat this. And I suggest in the paper that this is useful for them, because the goal is Siberian autonomy and self-governance, but looking at the quote-unquote backward condition and the sort of underdeveloped condition of Siberian infrastructure, demography, and any number of other criteria by which they measure progress and development, a precondition for autonomy is this kind of development and progress. They need schools, they need courts, they need more people, and a few other things. And so they use this kind of accusation of racial degeneration as a lever to try to get the state to pay attention to this question of Siberian development. So it's explicitly, at least in my reading, it's a they're speaking about race in these same scientific terms, right? And their Shopov says explicitly what we need is race science. And he's not coming out and making these claims in a kind of programmatic fashion that, you know, this is going to be a means to a Siberian autonomous end. That's my reading of what he's doing. They're very much trying to say, look, this is objective science. Like Marino was saying before, they didn't always draw conclusions. And I guess I'm sort of looking at the hidden agendas too, by putting together their political desires with his racial concept. So to kind of just finish up the sequence, so this eventually changes, and I argue because of a number of these developmentalist goals that start to get achieved in the Siberians' views, their view of race shifts. So they start talking about racial mixing and miscegenation not as degeneration, but as a productive force. That in fact, the Siberian mestizo has become the racial type that is best suited through these historical and environmental and biological processes to self-governing in Siberia. So we got a university. Well, maybe we need the state a little bit less, because now we can sort of point to this new racial mixed type as, you know, eventually we're going to take over ourselves. This shifts a third time at the beginning of the 20th century, and I argue this is in reaction to the fact that in my subtitle in this part of the paper, I ask too much of a good thing. So a huge number of resettlers start to move into Siberia in the 1890s, in the millions by the first decade of the 20th century. And I suggest that this threatens this kind of mestizo balance that the Siberian regionalists had tried to set up, that all of a sudden you have an influx, you kind of have too many Russians coming. And the Sibiryak, or this kind of Siberian racialized type, now starts to feel threatened that by their very own formula of how they had come to be through these processes of racial mixing, that identity was now being threatened because you now had a larger, too many Russians. It was throwing off the balance, so to speak. And so I suggest that at this point they start talking about race as a kind of supranational category. And I mean, they do start talking about it. I suggest that this is in reaction to these historical changes that have happened over time. And so this is all to say that I'm interested in trying to understand how, not only among scientists and anthropologists, and not only among Russians looking at non-Russians, but how did a group that didn't fit into one of those categories try to utilize this concept of race for a particular demonstrable political and social end. And it's all.
Okay, so my paper is, I guess, a little bit of an outlier. It's about the late Soviet period and also based primarily on oral history. And I want to start out by saying, I just want to make a few points about the paper. I'm not going to summarize the contents, but I just want to say, first of all, that this did not, it's part drawn from a book project, and the project did not start out as having anything to do with race. I wanted to write about mixed marriage, interethnic marriage in the Soviet Union, specifically in Soviet Central Asia, and I made the classic mistake of assuming that because people in the Soviet Union weren't talking about race, that it wasn't about race. I didn't even think about it. This is exactly what we've been talking about here. But even before David contacted me to ask if I would like to come and speak at this panel, I had started to figure out that it was, in fact, about race, and that at least to some extent, and or if not about race, then about some kind of race-like processes, and that the mere fact that the Soviet scholars who wrote about it called it Mir nationalny brak, and did not mean that it had nothing to do with race. So race kind of crept in through the back door of my project as I worked on it, for three reasons. The first is that one of the things that interests me, it's not present in this essay here, but in another chapter of the book, is how Soviet scholars, specifically ethnographers and to some extent ethno-sociologists, to use a nice term, how they studied and wrote about mixed marriage and how it was seen as relating to nationality policy. So, but as I read the work of the ethnographers and social scientists who studied intermarriage and the ethnos, the term for ethnic group that became popularized in the 1960s, I discovered that there was a kind of racial subtext to what they were saying, that there were debates about whether the ethnos was biological or social or biosocial. And Julian Bromley, one of the leading lights of this theory, was criticized for creating a kind of biological view of the ethnos by some other scholars. And all of these debates raised fundamental questions about the nature of human difference that I think echo debates that we've talked about today in the Tsarist period and that have taken place in other contexts as well, other times and places. This lack of a clear delineation between biological, social, historical, cultural notions of human identity groups, I think it became very clear to me that there was more going on here than just the ethnos. Bromley, in particular, argued that the fundamental characteristic of the ethnos, there's a famous article called Ethnos in Endogamia, and in which he argued that endogamy was the main characteristic of the ethnos. Of course, that's kind of a biological, physical argument. And that when a group starts to intermarry in large numbers, that signifies the impending dissolution of the ethnic group, and that therefore, the implication was therefore, intermarriage had implications for the dissolution, for the sort of merging and rapprochement of nationalities in the Soviet Union, and that this was one of the reasons why Soviet ethnographers were interested in intermarriage, because it potentially could lead to the merging of populations that they regarded as biologically discrete up to that time. That's not the only reason why they were interested in intermarriage, but that's one of them. So obviously that kind of got me thinking about race. And then second, my project has a big comparative aspect to it because when I got interested in studying this topic, partly because there's been so much written about mixed marriage, ethnic intermarriage, racial intermarriage, in just about every other part of the world except the Soviet Union. Soviet scholars did write a lot about it, but sort of Western and other scholars have written about the U.S., North America, Latin America, Australia, Europe, pretty much everywhere, and but not about the Soviet Union. I began looking at this literature, and of course this literature is mostly about race. So that also, and there were many parallels that I started finding between what I saw going on in the Soviet Union, despite the Soviet welcoming and celebration of mixed marriage. As I do show in the paper, in spite of a generally favorable attitude on the part of state and scholars and perhaps even society at large, not clear, toward intermarriage. Nevertheless, because of certain structures involving centralization and identification of nationality in the Soviet Union, individuals who intermarried or who were children of mixed families often faced some of the same dilemmas that mixed race individuals faced in other contexts. So that's the comparative angle also got me interested in the question of race. And another point about the comparative issue, Soviet scholars they frequently compared their enlightened policy toward racial mixing with the unenlightened policy of places like the United States, obviously Nazi Germany, South Africa, and other countries that had regimes of racial separation and apartheid. But at the same time, they selectively borrowed from the work of U.S. sociologists and Western sociologists and other social scientists as they analyzed interethnic relations and mixed marriages. So I found this interesting as well. And it reminded me actually when Vera Tolz gave her paper this morning, or when I read her paper rather, I also saw this same odd combination of condemnation and imitation, going on in an earlier period. So I thought that was an interesting parallel. So despite the use of different terminology, ethnic or national in one case, racial in the other, there were many similarities in U.S. and Soviet discourses and scholarship on mixing and intermarriage. And then finally, third, this essay that I wrote for this conference relies heavily on oral history methodology. And after looking at various sources, I ultimately concluded that for some of the questions I wanted to explore about people's subjective experiences of ethnic mixing and how people lived ethnicity and identity in the Soviet Union, I found that oral history is one of the best ways to investigate these kinds of questions. And what I have found is that as you can probably see from the paper, is that Soviet-era respondents speak about their experiences with ethnic mixing and with identity in ways that actually rather vividly recall the way people in other contexts talk about racial mixing, that some of the experiences are similar, they hold views that would be considered racialized in other contexts, and all of this in spite of the fact that really the context, the celebration, the welcoming of intermarriage in the Soviet Union stood in rather sharp contrast to what you find in many other places in the world. Also, there was my respondents engaged in rather frequent and unapologetic essentializing about national cultures, while also at the same time claiming to be internationalists. This is another aspect of holding two contradictory ideas in your mind at the same time. And examples of this kind of, I guess, essentializing are in the paper. You can see that, for example, people believe you can't have a nationality if you don't have it. You can't claim a nationality if you don't look the right way, that your looks, your name, your language, and so forth should all match. You know, kind of a nice little package in order for you to be able to claim a certain nationality and so forth. So I think the recollections and opinions of the people that I've interviewed provide rather vivid evidence of the difficulty in disentangling nationality, ethnos, and race, as well as the very complex and ambivalent attitudes toward mixing that go back a long way. And we've seen from David's paper and others that these go back deep into the Imperial period. So all of these factors have come together to make me think about race as I work on this project. So I welcome you.
At the risk of overstaying my welcome in terms of my allotted time, I do have to tell this very quick story because it's provoked by the all-in-one package remark, which was I was at an award ceremony recently, and I'm chairing my department, so I have to go to things like that. And I was sitting next to a young man from the law school, and we just chatted a very little bit, and I certainly didn't hear any accent in his English. And he looked to me, since I am from New York, from a Russian Jewish immigrant family, like somebody from a very similar background as myself. And at some point he said, "What do you work on?" I said, "Brazil." He started speaking to me in Portuguese. It turns out he was Brazilian. He was from Rio. He was from a Jewish family, but he was from a Jewish family that lives in Rio. And it really took me about 30 seconds to realize he was speaking to me in Portuguese, at which point we then conducted our discussion entirely in Portuguese for the rest of the day. But it was, even for me, and I spent a lot of time in Brazil, and I know that Brazilians look like everything, because Brazil is a country of immigrants. Even for me, there was this moment of sort of incredulity when he started speaking to me in what was clearly Carioca or Rio Portuguese. So anyhow, so forgive the anecdote. I want to start by, after that, thanking David and Yanni for the invitation. I am really the most of the people speaking today. I am certainly the most outside the field. I'm not even a Europeanist. So my field is Brazil. So I hope if I mispronounce anything or use the wrong terms for anything, I hope I will get an extra measure, a kind of free pass on certain things. These are two very interesting papers that work on very different time periods and problematics, as well as deal with very different types of sources and evidence, but both deal with the challenge of a multi-ethnic empire, whether Russian or Soviet, and the way in which ethnic, regional, national identities get racialized, i.e. portrayed as innate and lending themselves to hierarchical notions of difference. So those are the two things that I would say you have to be talking about race or racialization. Having just published this week a book on race and regional identity in Brazil, it's a little bit easier for me to comment on David Rainbow's paper, so I will start there, and basically what I'll be doing is using the Brazilian case to think about some of the general ideas about race and regions circulating in the latter decades of the 19th century, and the possible specificities of the Siberian case. As someone mentioned before, we should never expect consistency in racial discourses, so I'm of the school that exact comparisons, you may know there's an enormous literature comparing Brazilian race relations and US race relations, Brazil and Cuba, Brazil, and I think particularly that social science literature that tries to do a very exact comparison, is really a waste of time. And nobody should have, if you, so, sorry if there are any sociologists in the room that, so, I mean, they're interesting to think about as discourses about race, but they're not actually interesting to think about as. So Brazil is often invoked in conversations about race, but in fact there's a kind of shallowness to the invocation of Brazil, which almost always is around whether the idea of Brazil as a racial democracy is a myth or a reality or an aspiration, etc. What most people don't do is go back and look at earlier discourses about race and region in Brazil, so that's where I'm going to go today. So the theme that David is analyzing will be familiar to anyone who has studied Brazil, which is the relationship between, particularly in the early part of the paper, but I think it goes through the paper, the relationship between race mixing and degeneration. In Brazil, the figure most associated with this idea is a man who was sort of an early anthropologist, Raimundo Nina Rodrigues, who was from the north of Brazil, significantly from the north, the area of Brazil that will be sort of identified by the late 19th century as the sort of regional problem, as backward, as impoverished, as disorderly. And his work started appearing in the 1890s, and he saw Brazil's lack of progress as due to the mixture of Europeans with inferior races. So this is a very different, most people will know sort of Brazil from Gilberto Freire forward, who has the much more optimistic notion of race mixing in Brazil. But the dominant notion in this period was, in the 1890s, was this pessimistic notion. And just a quick note, I have no idea if this could go, you could go anywhere with this, but Nina Rodrigues is publishing in the decade following the definitive emancipation of slaves in Brazil in 1888. And Adrienne is publishing and Shopov, and then in the decades following the emancipation of serfs, maybe not in Siberia, but I think there may be a kind of generalized anxiety about the sort of human capital of a society where there's no longer the same coercive mechanisms to get people to work and be obedient. So what I found most fascinating in David's paper is his tracing of the shifts in discourses about Siberian identity from the 1860s to the 1890s. So in this relatively short period, you have some significant shifts. I was particularly struck by the fact that on the one hand, you have the same discourse of racial mixing and degeneration, but in some ways it's a more optimistic reading of racial mixing and degeneration, because the argument is not that the mixing is causing degeneration because of inferior races, but because of the poor quality of the Russians who are being sent to Siberia and mixing with the, so it's, I mean, optimistic, obviously, it's in quotation marks. So unlike Nina Rodrigues, who has a really determinist notion of degeneration in Brazil, this, at least in the 60s, there's this more, 1860s, there is this more specific problem about racial mixing and degeneration. But this is a very, this idea about degeneration and race mixing is of course very widespread in this period. I also was surprised that in the 1860s, even though these are kind of Siberian regionalists come nationalists, there are very few virtues being invested in the Siberia, at least from what I could see in your paper. What we do see, though, over time is a sort of subsiding of the Siberian nationalism, but a greater and greater valorizing of the Siberian himself, or herself, really, because much of the mixing is involving Siberian women, not men, if I'm reading your paper correctly, that these Russians who are coming into Siberia are often taking Siberian women as wives, is that so? And one of the things might be to think about what that means in terms of the gendering of race mixing. And you even get, by the 1890s, Yadrintsev referring to the future Siberian Yankee, which is a kind of interesting figure. In a much more abridged and rapid way, we can see a similar shift in discourses on degeneration in Brazil, but especially about racial types in the region that will become known as the Nordeste, or the Northeast. with the publication Euclides da Cunha's magnum opus, Os Sertões, which is translated into English as Rebellion in the Backlands. Drawing on a similar melange of biological racial types, the impact of a harsh environment, and spatiality, da Cunha at first seems to be reiterating his predecessor, Nina Rodriguez's lament about the degenerative impact of racial mixing and the poor quality of Brazil's human resources, or what we'll later call human capital, especially in the increasingly impoverished Northeast. About a fifth of the way through the book, da Cunha's argument takes a crucial turn, and he insists that the backlands of the Nordeste have actually produced a particular type that is authentically Brazilian and has the potential to be the vigorous core of our nationality. Though, that's a quote, though he sees the backlander as mixed, it's the isolation in subsequent centuries of the backlander from civilized society which is seen as the key to his vigor. And I was going to read, so I think I'll run out of time if I do it. I have some quotes from da Cunha that are quite interesting, in which he makes the argument that this type can eventually become an authentic, vigorous Brazilian, precisely because he has in some way not been prematurely challenged by the impact of civilization. In short, what was typically seen as a problem, isolation from civilizing forces, is now transformed into an advantage. Some hints of a similar argument, I think, are in the final versions of Yadrintsev's writings about Siberian regional identity, as the influx of Russian settlers with the completion of the railroad starts to pose a threat. Though both writers are dealing, here I mean Yadrintsev and da Cunha, are dealing with a space that has been constructed as a distinct region and one that has been disadvantaged vis-a-vis the central space, it's worth considering what difference it made that the Nordeste was part of the Brazilian nation and Nordestino, Northeastern intellectuals and politicians decried any attempt to treat the Northeast as somehow existing in an inferior or colonial relationship to the center. Whereas the Siberian intellectuals, you argue, actually kind of embrace that relationship. But I would argue that even though they seem quite different, in fact, because the Northeasterners increasingly have to invoke the misery and backwardness of their region in order to get any kind of attention from the central government, and particularly from São Paulo, which is becoming the locomotive of Brazil's economy. In order to get that attention, they have to position themselves as backward and inferior. And so I think that ultimately they construct a kind of colonial relationship, even as they would never use that term. I also just want to say very quickly, going back to the question about whether race is an indelible marker and the relationship between culture and biology, that Eugenics in Brazil is a very interesting book by Nancy Steppen that I think a lot of you may know, called The Hour of Eugenics, in which she argues that in Latin America in general, but Brazil in particular, there's a persistence of a certain Lamarckian notion of heredity that she sees not as the kind of backwardness of Brazilian science, but in some sense a deliberate misreading of scientific evidence, precisely because Brazilian intellectuals adopted a notion of soft eugenics, which allowed them to argue that racial problems could be resolved through changing the environment, to having better hygiene, better education, better health care, and that these could literally produce better racial stock. And that's very similar to some of what you're talking about in relationship to Siberia. Okay, since I've already used up my time, I would move to Adrienne Edgar's fascinating paper, though it is one that I feel less equipped to comment on, even in a vaguely comparative sense. But I'll try to mention some interesting parallels, and what I think are interesting parallels and contrasts, and raise some questions. This is one of the most striking cases I've ever seen of the way in which a bureaucratic procedure produces identity. Though of course not independent of other spheres of cultural, legal, and political discourse. All of us live in a world where official declarations require us to flatten or condense our complicated identities in something legible to the state, starting with our own passports. So I may spend lots of time in Brazil and feel sometimes like I'm almost Brazilian, but I've still got a US passport. I can't have an almost Brazilian passport. So, But again, this seems like an especially striking case, and I think by looking at children of mixed marriages, Adrienne is not only illuminating their dilemmas, but a larger process of racialized identity formation for all inhabitants of the Soviet Union. In some sense, the Brazilian case seems exactly the opposite, since Brazilians, and not just in official discourse, but every day in Brazilian conversation, tend to celebrate their racial mixedness, and often identify the mulatto as the quintessential Brazilian. Activists in black consciousness movements in Brazil, and also those from outside of Brazil, often criticize mixed Brazilians for not checking one box. So, at the same time, and it's interesting, the term that has now emerged in Brazil as to signify people don't so much call themselves black as they're using, or Afro-Brazilian, as they're using Afrodescendente, African descendant, which can include somebody who has a lot of African descent or a little African descent. So I think it's a kind of adjustment to that issue. At the same time, whiteness is highly valued in many spheres of Brazilian life, the way Russianness is valorized in Adrienne's cases. So one question I had in reading this paper is how to understand the tensions and contradictions between the official celebration of mixed nationalities, the lack of formal or official stigma, and the sense that identities other than Russian are somehow inferior. Especially interesting to consider is the way in which her interviewees see Russian identity as impossible for them, as a form of almost slightly absurd passing. And it's really interesting, those discussions of sort of, it sort of reminds me a little bit of the idea of the colonial mimic man, that you sort of, no matter how much you try to look like the civilized man, you're always going to seem a little bit absurd. So, for those who don't look Russian enough, Russianness seems to be a form of whiteness, which prompts me to want to know what is meant when an informant says everything about them is Russian. So it's on page 9. And I was also wondering what the emphasis, all this has been kind of discussed, I wrote these comments obviously before hearing the other conversations, so what the emphasis on nationality means, not only for those who are mixed, but for other identities that don't graft so easily onto nationality. Pierre Bourdieu, in an essay subtitled A Critical Reflection on the Idea of Region, calls regional identity a performative identity because those promoting identification with the region cannot deploy the mechanisms of the state. What is interesting here is that these regional come national identities emerge from both a bureaucratic mechanism and are reinforced by the performance of nationality. So that brings me to ask who then controls the borders of the appropriate cultural performance? Because many of your informants or interviewees talk about not being able to perform the culture. And also, again, what does this have to do with gender? In closing, Adrienne comes back to the point about the Soviet state generally being, quote, supportive of ethnic mixing and intermarriage, unquote. What does that mean, given the contradiction between that claim and the refusal to allow multiple national identities? How should we understand this official position? And I want to say here that one of the themes in a lot of the discussion of race in Brazil that I've been very critical of is what I call gap thinking. That is the gap between official discourse and everyday behavior. Actually, I think it's a very problematic way to think about it because it somehow assumes that we should expect people to adhere to official discourse in very literal ways. So people say, there's lots of opportunity, the government says there's lots of opportunity for social mobility in the United States, that everybody agrees that that's true and then adheres to it. I mean, clearly not. So there's always gaps. That the gap itself can't explain anything because the gap is always there. So a constant can't explain a variable. So in effect, what I would argue is there is always many subtexts to that official position that clearly explain not only that people don't adhere perfectly to government pronouncements, but that people don't even feel that they have to adhere to government pronouncements. So is this a relatively meaningless piece of Soviet political correctness? Is the emphasis on a single nationality a response to political pressures from leaderships in ethnic groups? Is it a kind of strategic essentialism? Is it about anxiety to protect Russian identity as the core identity of the empire? So I will end there. Thank you.
Congratulations on the book.
Oh, thank you.
Everyone with you?
No, actually, these are other books. I thought it would be sort of creepy to bring my own.
Keep those questions in mind. We all do it.
I'd love to respond if we have time. I'm afraid I'll forget the questions otherwise. So they were such good questions. Do you want to respond or to?
Sure.
Go ahead. Oh, okay. Yes, no, thank you for your great comments and questions. And I do think the Brazil comparison, I actually just published an article I co-authored about ethnic mixing in Soviet and contemporary Kazakhstan with a Kazakh colleague of mine in a book called Global Mixed Race, which has articles about, Brazil and, various other places where there's a lot of literature about racial mixing. And it is a very, very interesting comparison. Yeah, just a couple of your questions I think were really interesting. This question of how can the USSR be said to be supportive of ethnic mixing if at the same time it doesn't allow multiple nationalities? It's a really good question, and I think it relates to this kind of irresolvable contradiction in the late Soviet Union between, nationalities that have become increasingly entrenched. I think there was a process, a number of people have argued, in which because of the creation of ethno-territorial republics, nationalities became increasingly entrenched. So there were, pressures from elites in these, people had vested interest in having these nationalities. But at the same time, there was Soviet internationalism and the desire to create a Soviet identity. And these two things, in some ways were mutually contradictory, so are working against each other, maybe not completely contradictory. And so I don't think it was just empty rhetoric. I think certainly there was, official welcoming in the sense that people who intermarried in Soviet Central Asia, for example, even if their families and their local community were opposed to the marriage, their local neighborhood, whatever, they could kind of count on support from higher ups, people at their job, people in the Komsomol. I've had many cases, they're not really in this essay, but many cases in which, people were hesitant to marry their interethnically, their sweetheart, and, people in the Komsomol or at their job would say, come on, what are you waiting for? We'll have a party for you, even if your family's opposed to it. And also, interethnically married people would sometimes be singled out instead. Frequently, they would be singled out. People recall, when I was in school, my teacher in my Marxism-Leninism class said, Dilbar is an example of a Soviet person. Stand up, Dilbar, because she was a mixed person. So there was this kind of valorization. Yeah, exactly. Now, it didn't mean that, they weren't people, it doesn't mean that people, they didn't get financial benefits or a new apartment or anything for being, interethnically married. I mean, maybe it didn't mean that much, but nevertheless, I think people were aware that there was a positive policy toward it. And so it created a different context, for people. But you're right, there's a contradiction there, and I can't really, answer that. And then on the question of who controls the borders of appropriate culture performance, this is something I'm really interested in, and I have a chapter about gender, in mixed marriage in the book, and it has, as you could probably tell from the example of the Kazakh woman who felt that she couldn't perform Kazakhnas because of the way she'd been brought up. It frequently is, women who feel that they're not measuring up and performing, the nationality that they supposedly belong to. And people frequently express regret, frustration, and so forth, that they can't, that they don't feel authentic, that they don't feel authentic. So, yes, it's important. Gender is an important aspect here. So I guess that was.
Yeah, thanks very much for reading our papers and for those great comments. And I'm so glad that your book is coming out this week because
It's out.
It's out.
It's
Because based on all of the parallels, I otherwise would have had to learn Portuguese in this case because there were some uncanny connections here.
Yeah, and even this book, the invention of the Brazilian Northeast, is now out in English, so it just came out, so that's why I brought it to show it.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
No need to learn Portuguese.
Yeah. Good. So I'll comment on three of the points that you brought up. I think that the question of the distinction that you drew between the Northeastern kind of denial of colonial status, yet wanting to maintain that, you know, backwardness was a sort of justified a certain kind of special attention, versus the Siberian case, which is explicitly, I mean, the argument of this big, long book, which is called Siberia as a Colony, is to convince people that we ought to view this region as a colony. And it's more or less, I mean, this is probably a debatable point, and in the literature it's been debated, but it's more or less accepted that we can view Siberia as a colony. I mean, you have imperial officials start to use colonial language like Colonia to describe, you know, their Asian colony, and it wasn't a kind of problematic category, you know, in the sense that it becomes in the 20th century. And it was a way of kind of probably putting a sharper focus on what kind of piece of empire is it. You know, it's not the same as the core of the European core of the empire. So what is it? And they're all imperial officials, and Yadrinsev certainly is looking all around to try to find the best analogy to what Siberia is. And of course, his favorite example is Britain's 13 colonies in North America because they became independent. But he wasn't making that up, I guess is the point. So he's drawing on other kind of colonial theories about progress and how colonies are destined to kind of surpass the metropole because of they avoided some of these problems of over-civilization and so on. So I think I need to do more. I think there's more to be said about the significance of that insistence upon, you know, the status of Siberia as a colony, and especially hearing your comments. I mean, I think that distinction bears that out. That it's, you know, what exactly does that mean? And I think I need to think more about that. This idea that the northeastern Brazilians are the vigorous core of a new Brazilian nationality is completely fascinating too. And there's a similar, though slightly distinct, idea in Siberia. They do have the idea that Siberians, through this alienation, in part spatially from the rest of Russia, but also through this intermixing, have kind of preserved, as I say in the paper, have preserved the best of the Russian nationality, which, you know, back in European Russia, as it's industrializing, it's kind of degrading in its own way. And in Siberia, this, we call it utopia, they eventually kind of try to see it that way. We've avoided some of those problems. But they don't ever come around to, at least the figures that I'm looking at, they don't ever come around to say we're actually the real Russians until the Civil War. So after the Bolshevik Revolution and the Russian Empire explodes into, you know, a few dozen pieces that all claiming autonomy and sovereignty in many cases, some of these same Siberian regionalists and the next generation come to be at the center of the anti-Bolshevik movement in Siberia and end up saying that the Bolsheviks have destroyed true Russianness through all of their antics in European Russia. We are preserving true Russianness, and it's our destiny to sort of preserve it until such time that we can replant it in St. Petersburg. So there's this interesting moment where it does become Siberia as the preserver of Russianness. And I talk about this in my larger project, but how it bears on this racial question. I mean, I essentially see the racialization of Siberia, as Yadrinsev is talking about, it becomes less and less significant. So that by the time you get to the revolution, they can completely abstract this identity from biology. And it becomes this kind of almost very much more easily transplantable identity, and then it ends up becoming Russian. But for Yadrinsev and his generation, they're trying to insist that Siberian is different than Russian. So that's very important to them. And then this idea of, the phrase combined development comes to my mind, coming from the Russian field, but avoiding civilization and therefore being in a position to more quickly advance to a higher level of civilization is a trope that repeats over and over and over and over in not only in Russia, I know, but all the way from early 19th century, you have the Slavophiles and the Westernizers debating whether or not Russia's backwardness is advantageous because they've avoided the worst parts of European Enlightenment, or whether it's stunted their potential for growth. And right, this gets repeated by the Marxists, it gets repeated by Trotsky and Lenin, and it becomes this motif of trying to spin backwardness to advantage. I mean, it comes up with Bridget's Gypsies, right, where they're saying, look, the fact that we're backward is actually a way of kind of launching into a new reality. And so this, I think, also warrants more attention and more comparative attention. Thank you very much.
I just want to say very quickly, since most people here are not Brazilian, is that, of course, the man in the backlands was not isolated. He's only presented as isolated, but I do want to make it clear that there's actually no isolation at all. It's only an imagined isolation.
Dear, thank you very much for a very interesting paper. There was a comment and question at the same time. In the morning, we talked about the importance of looking at institutional structures and settings to understand particular discourses of race. And I think also what is very important to understanding debates we are talking about, not just institutional settings, but broad intellectual frameworks, both national and transnational. And so in this connection, I'm wondering whether your original list, you mentioned briefly that they compare Siberia with Australia or the United States, but is there any discussion of contemporary debates about racial mixing in Portuguese colonies, Spanish colonies, so the debates Barbara referred to, are they aware that there is a debate on the same issue they're interested in other colonial contexts? Here, in terms of sort of importance of these intellectual networks, you mentioned that Patanian is a later generation of regionalists. He stops using race as an important analytical category. It's not an important category. But Patanian is part of the network of this new school of Orientology led by Wilson. And this school explicitly rejects race as a concept of analysis. So in a way, it's not surprising that Patanian is very influenced by Wilson and his disciples, that he also doesn't have this concept. So it might be not related to particular development of regionalism per se, but so this regionalists get involved in a particular intellectual network. And then I have a question to you, Edgar. Most of your examples are mixed marriages between non-Russians, and a strong sense among children of those marriages that they're perceived as somehow ethnically impure. So it seems to be very widespread negative attitude.
Do you mean mixed marriages of Russians and
between non-Russians?
between non?
Yeah. So it seems to me, when we read in your paper, that there is sort of among children of mixed marriages of non-Russians a very strong sense that the communities around them perceive that there is something, some kind of impurity in them. I don't know whether it's correct really. But then, of your paper, then my question was, what is it a more benign view of mixed marriages between when it's between Russians and an ethnic minority? And what does the kind of Russians or themselves or not Russians who are not a product of mixed marriage, they are not personally at all kind of affected. What's their view of mixed marriage?
Yes.
So kind of what's the external view? That's kind of how all these perceptions relate to the specificity of the Soviet kind of affirmative action empire policy, where for policymakers it's much easier if people really belong to a particular nationality, even if they celebrate mixed marriages. But just jumping from that, spectrum. That's not a mainstream view to condemn mixed marriages.
Within Russia.
Within Russia. Among the, let's say, Russian, the Russian discourse. Then I look briefly at Tatarstan, where the criticism of mixed marriages was more widespread, interestingly, and more part of the mainstream kind of discourse about constructing a Tatar national identity. And that probably kind of links to this difference to what was going on in the Soviet period.
Do you want to go first, Edgar?
Sure. Thank you for those comments and questions. So, in terms of their engagement with contemporary debates about mixing and anxiety or otherwise in other colonial settings, they mention, so far as I've found, they mention them, but in a relatively unsystematic way. So, I mean, this allusion to the Siberian Yankee was in the context of talking about how people change in a colonial setting and become something new. In the discussion in this chapter that he has on race, on racial mixing in Siberia. So it's to me, it's very clear that he's holding up other colonial settings as models, not only in how administratively a colony develops within an empire to eventually become autonomous and self-governing, but how colonists change in racial and national terms. And I think that he's very clearly kind of saying, he's doing a few interesting things there. He's not only saying that there's a kind of racial transformation that happens by virtue of being sent out to a new place and engaging with a new environment and new people and all of that. But he's also, of course, provocatively suggesting that based on that racial transformation, political independence is conceivable, connected. And that's kind of his bar in this polemic, saying, like, if we have Siberian Yankees, you know what that means, wink, wink. It means revolution. And they say elsewhere, what Siberia needs is its Ben Franklin's and its Thomas Jefferson's. And so they very clearly see themselves as trying to create a future that way. However, Yadrinsev in 1893 was the Chicago World's Fair, I think, and came to the U.S. for the first time to visit the U.S. after he had been kind of, dreaming about it for decades, and kind of famously quipped that now having seen it, the United States is in fact the future of Siberia, only it's probably going to be about 1,000 years from now. So he was kind of despairing.
It's a big not yet.
That's right. I mean, I'm still a orthodox believer in historical progress and teleology, but it's just a really slow grade incline was kind of his takeaway. So the answer, I guess, is I think that they're aware of it, but they don't systematically lay out what they think of that. They make allusions to Siberia as Russia's Mexico and Russia's Peru and Russia's Brazil and all of these things, but that's also in the context of a source of gold for the metrical. So it's not always a racial type of analogy. And then in the importance of Patanin's shift, I take this point very well, because this is one of the methodological chinks, I think, in how I framed this, is that I feel like there's a little bit of a bait and switch between, I'm talking about a transformation in Yadrintsev's thinking over time, which to me is very clear and indicates something. But then Yadrintsev dies in 1894, and the most dramatic of the demographic and institutional and administrative changes that happen in Siberia happen after Yadrintsev dies. And Patanin had been around since the 1860s. He was a contemporary, as you know. But you're right that he had a different set of interests, and he had never really been out beating the kind of racial drum, so to speak, and trying to say that Siberians have constituted a new race. He was interested in a different set of questions. So it probably is the case that the shift from Yadrintsev's later ideas to Patanin can't make quite as strong an argument that these ideas are changing based on changes in the landscape, because it's a different person. I will say, though, that in these debates that I use to represent Batanin's view, he's debating the legacy of Yadrinson. So it's a debate with the person who's taking Yadrinsen's position at Eastern Review, and it's over the legacy of what Yadrinsen had argued. So that's the subject of the debate. And so I understand Batanin as almost reluctantly taking up this mantle of, I need to defend this kind of hero of our movement. He's not here. I never really was on board with those ideas necessarily, but I'm going to kind of change them in my own way. So I think methodologically I do need to be attentive to that fact, that it's a different person.
Can I just interject on that thread of the Western influence? There's a wonderful book by Jaime Philips called Russian America, and in it we find out that in 1802 do we get the first instance of the Russians using the category of Creole, total culture Western. And Jaime Philips makes a point that this has never been applied on the Russian mainland. For example, in Siberia, it was never a legal category there. However, it was a legal category in Alaska. In Alaska was, as we know, managed by a mutual, stock trading company, right, by the Russian American company. And his point is that because these weren't sort of officials trickling in through the center across the mainland, but rather people who have sailed and, made calls in all kinds of colonial ports where they could see such categories being in existence, it is because of that that they bring this sort of exposure to other places where such categories are legal, then into their management practices of the Alaska. And this was a trade in the 1820s. There was a new contract being negotiated where I think this category Creole was put in place.
So I wanted to respond to Mayor Tolson's question, very interesting question. So yes, I think actually most of the cases I have here are mixes of some other nationality with Russian. There are quite a few who are not, but including the big case I use of in the middle of a woman who's part Tatar, part Kazakh, who married a Russian guy. But most of the people I talk about here are in fact mixtures of either Russian and Central Asian nationality or Ukrainian and Central Asian nationality. There are others as well, but so I don't think that it's necessarily the case that people who are mixtures of non-Russian nationalities are more likely to think about ethnic impurity. What I do think is the case, and I think the example you gave about Tatars and Russians and the use of intermarriage, what I do think is the case is that very often families, Central Asian families, are more upset about intermarriage than Russian families. And I over and over again encountered people who said, well, my husband's family or my wife's family, they were internationalists, they didn't have any problem with him or her marrying a Central Asian, but my parents said no way. so there is some and I think this largely anecdotal evidence is borne out by a very limited amount of survey evidence from the Soviet period. Actually, Leocadia Drobezheva, a sociologist, did some study. There was a big public opinion study in 5 different republics that was done in the 70s. Very little of that evidence was ever published, and most of it is still in the private homes of the people who did the research. So it's hard; you can't actually get your hands on it, but apparently it showed quite a bit of showed quite a bit of opposition to interethnic marriage on the part of Uzbeks. That didn't come out until the perestroika period. But also Leocadia Drobezheva was able to publish an article about some of the Tatar that argued that Tatar opposition to mixed marriage in Tatarstan was much higher than Russian opposition. Like 4 to 5 times as many Tatars were opposed to it as Russians. I mean, this is when they're asked, how do you feel about it? This is not that when they're actually facing someone in their family marrying someone of a different nationality. But in fact, the interviews in Central Asia at least bear out that there seems to be a greater tendency to oppose such marriages on the part of Central Asian families. It's not universal, but I think the reason has nothing to do with that. I would say nothing to do with it, but I don't think it necessarily has anything to do with ethnic impurity in most cases. I think it has to do with cultural expectations and family traditions and fears that a spouse, especially a wife, if your son marries a woman of a different nationality, they're not going to be able to fulfill the cultural expectations of a woman within your society. So I think it has something to do with that. I don't know if that answers your question.
First, just to reinforce what Lisa was just saying, a quote from the 1860s by a Russian naval officer, some sort of visiting a Russian colony in the Aleutian Islands, and he counts, and there it turns out there are 1,896 Creoles there. That's the term he uses. And he describes them as follows: in the general scheme of things, it would seem that children should belong to the estate to which their fathers belong. In the colonies, this scheme is changed. It is enough to be born Creole to become a completely independent person, knowing no obligations, living and acting for oneself alone. But then he talks a little bit about the ways in which both sides are pretty unhappy with that. That's anecdotal, however. What I would like is to remind you of the longer title of a rather famous book that emerges, that's published in 1859, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, in which very famously Darwin neglects to talk about human beings. And the other shoe doesn't drop until 1871 with The Descent of Man. And that's what's great about Shapov, because he's not put off by that in the least. It's like, let's take these lessons from artificial breeding, you know, the pigeons, the cows, whatever, the sheep, move on to talk about Siberians, okay? And remember, he's half boy after himself. But what I would suggest is that you follow up on Florinsky, we encountered earlier, I'm sure, but for the following reason. He's one of the founders of Tomsk University. Right? He's an obstetrician, trained as an obstetrician, he teaches for a time in Kazan, but he publishes this almost book-length set of essays in Ruska Slova in the 1860s, which uses this very term, preservation of races, only it's усовершенствование and it's порода, right? So improvement, but порода, right? And what is he concerned about? He's not concerned particularly with skin traits and the like. He's concerned with consanguinity and the problem of marriage, intermarriage, good intermarriage for the future. Okay, and the title of his essay is, on the improvement and degeneration of the human race. Plural, I guess, and I don't know anything about his, Tomsk career, but to me it's utterly fascinating that he ends up there, right, as one of the founders of the university, and I have no idea what he does there, but that's, I think, a fascinating connection that's very much worth pursuing.
Yeah, thank you for that. I don't know. I haven't looked at him in this connection, so I don't know. I mean, it would have been later, so that the university doesn't open until 1888, so it would have been.
Right. But he's one of these founding figures who is helping set it up.
Yeah, yeah. No, thank you for that.
I think I can't resist a story to kind of reinforce something that Adrienne said. My in-laws were mixed couple, Chuvash and sort of Russian. But after they got married, this was in the 1950s, they had to make their trip to the father's village in Chuvash Republic. And the first thing that the wife had to do was to bake pirozhki for the entire village without anything. And in a sense, prove that she could fulfill these functions as a woman was expected to do within the Chuvash milieu. Fortunately, there was a younger sister who came in at the last minute and saved the day and showed her how to do it. But really resonated very well. But my question, partly I kind of want to push David a little bit on the idea of race in the context of the governance in particular. I certainly don't doubt that he used the term race, the idea of race, but does that mean that we have to, in a sense? When we talk about what Shapov was doing, what Shapov was thinking about, as an analytical term in our own analysis, to talk about this as a usage of race. And we talked about the terminological disarray, I think that's the word, term very used successfully, to describe the way that these ideas of race are being used. So the question is, do we jump into the pool, and start swimming around in this disarray ourselves, or do we try to draw some distinctions? Which might be looking at someone like Yadrinsev and saying, well, he was using a language of race, but is that what he was really talking about? So in that regard, I'm curious about this character of this category of Siberian that Yadrinsev is putting forward. First as an object of apprehension and degeneration, then later as an object of valorization and hope. I'm wondering, how are these Siddhiki marked? How are they made legible in Yadrintsev's description? Would I know one when I saw one? When I was walking down the street? How are these people identified or identifiable in Yadrin's way of doing things? Or is he just simply describing some sort of new type that might not necessarily be automatically visible? How does that work? And what would your argument be that this is not just terminological disarray, this is actually race?
On this point, do you want to
No,
comment? Okay.
I've got a question for Edgar.
Do you want to, we've got a few more from the queue. Do you want to hit this one now, or should we?
We can take a few
Okay.
questions and I'll remember.
Well, thank you for this very interesting presentations. And just, David's paper made me think about Siberia. There's absolutely a unique case when we really can talk about this politics of comparison because they're so kind of open about these comparative cases and context. And my question with regard to this comparison is about this regionalist being also interpreted as federalist. So one thing is to use colonial to interpret the American experience as this colonial experience, but what about federalism in their rhetoric and how this plays into the understanding of colony and colonized subject and mestizos and everything else? And also what really strikes me as very interesting is that generally in the context of Russian development in the late 19th and early 20th century, you have this proliferation of mass politics in the early 20th century, and then with the post-Russian revolution, you have the first Russian parliament, so you have this ideal context for proliferation of racial ideas and racial discourses, and all these utopias about, again, mixed racial type becoming not just a metaphor and utopian thing, but almost a political program. And you have this proto-eugenesis utopias again about how to create this modern mestizo. And at the same time, what you observe in Siberia is almost refusal to embrace race again in political debates. This is usually described as, mostly oriented toward embracing Russian national identity rather than playing race again. So can you comment on this? Why, in the context of modern politics of the Russian Empire, Siberian intellectuals decided not to embrace race? And I have also a question for Edgar. Again, absolutely amazing material, very interesting observations, but can you compare attitude toward inter-ethnic marriage, yes, in Central Asia and in Kazakhstan, in Kazan, which implies marriage between Russians and Asian people and Muslim people, and inter-ethnic marriage between Slavs, again, I'm using quotation marks here, but between Ukrainians and Russians, for example, whether you have the same anxiety, and whether, the Central Asian case is indeed very special, and if you have difference between, say, marriages within the Slavic family and, between Muslims and Slavs, Asian people and Slavs. So I think this actually tells you that this is not only about culture, but also about race, something which is not spelled out maybe, but is implicit. And I have a question about whether the level of urbanization plays any role, because again, Central Asia compared to European Russia, you have less urban centers and also less movement from villages to these big cities, less intermixture, kind of less receptive social environment to this marriages.
Take one more and then you roll with those.
Yes, so I have, I guess, a gender question for both of you. So I noticed in your paper, Adrienne, that the majority of your interviewees, and this may not be the case for the pool in general, the ones that entered here are mostly women. So I wonder if this identity of being a child of a mixed race weighed more heavily on women as opposed to men. And I wonder if you could push that in a different way and say that, would it be possible that the men of mixed marriages are more rewarded for being in a career trajectory? So in some ways, there's a real compensation for being the offspring of a mixed marriage. And so that what we're really seeing is this sort of, I think what we call a gap between official pronouncement and the practice. That something is going on where it's bearing more heavily, or weighing more heavily on women's experience of mixed marriage. The question that I have for David is this idea of mixed marriage, miscegenation, sort of explored by Robinson. Whether he had in mind, whenever he talked about mixed marriage, he's really thinking about male Russian settlers marrying male women, and that he actually, did he conceive of male Russian, wooden Russian settlers marrying indigenous people? Because when there's a resettlement, usually the peasants go as households. It's all, they don't really accept adventures, they don't go as individuals, then they go as male. So is it for him, he could conceive of miscegenation in a very positive way because he saw it as a male Russian settler marrying a female other. So in that sense, the process of assimilation is more, I guess, sure to favor the male side. Question about, whether actually there's a kind of a gender process in this way of thinking about miscegenation. And I want to address Nathaniel's question about terminological disarray. If they didn't use these terms, why should we use them? Well, I think the minute they start to talk about mixed marriages, I want to be very provocative here. If it's talking about race, in a sense that why can't we think about a man taking a woman taking a man? Suddenly that sort of cohabitation comes to be seen as mixed. So where does this idea of mixing comes from?
If I could I just want to jump in and relate to that very quickly, that, so Gilberto Freire, who is the kind of historian / sociologist most associated with the sort of creation of the idea of Brazil as a racial democracy, and basically celebrates sort of the mixedness of Brazilian society. In his historical, retelling of this mixing narrative, it's always a European man and a non-European, usually African-descended woman, never the other way around.
Would you mind if I went first, David? I'm afraid I'm going to, just going off that, actually, one of the things that scholars of intermarriage, not in Russia and the Soviet Union, but elsewhere have pointed out is that the official attitudes, sort of state attitudes, and scholarship on marriage is highly gendered in the sense that particular kinds of gender combinations tend to attract all the attention. Whether it's Russian men with indigenous women in Siberia, or whether or some other combination, there tends to be certain types of intermarriage that attract more attention. And in the case of Soviet Central Asia, it's the combination of Russian women with Central Asian men, interestingly, That's a more common combination than the other way around. That attracted a lot of scholarly attention because Russian women were seen as kind of bringers of modernity to the Central Asian village, bringers of modern Russian Soviet culture to Central Asia. But I wanted to respond to Marina's questions first of all. So about comparing different kinds of intermarriages. Well, I didn't do any research in Tatarstan, so I can't say from firsthand, experience anything about that, except that, there are a lot of Tatars in Central Asia, so I have a lot of examples of, intermarriages involving Tatars and Russians, Tatars and other people. What I would say is, so that the official kind of celebration of mixed marriage, which involved counting up lots of statistics and every year pronouncing that the rate of mixed marriage is rising, thereby showing that the Soviet nationalities all love each other. These statistics indiscriminately included all possible combinations. And of course, the most common kinds of mixed marriage were Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian with each other, and then various kinds of Muslims with each other, Uzbeks and Tajiks, Tatars and Kazakhs and so forth. So those were by far the most common. The ones that were less common were, Russians marrying Central Asians and so forth. But certainly, one thing I would say was interesting in all my attempts to advertise and find respondents, I simply said I'm looking for people who were in ethnically mixed marriage. However people do, I didn't define it. Not once did someone come and say, my parents are Russian and Ukrainian, they're in a mixed marriage, you want to talk to them? Not once. And I think it's a reflection of the fact that people didn't even consider this mixed marriage, especially not in the Central Asian context, where kind of all the Eastern Slavs were all kind of regarded as being one group. What is different is in the, what I did find, actually I found, I did interview quite a few people who were mixed marriages in different Muslim nationalities, Tajiks and Uzbeks, Tatars and Kazakhs, Tatars and Uzbeks and so forth. And there, despite similarities in religion and so forth, there were real cultural differences, especially in Tajikistan, that people talked about these marriages having been difficult or having aroused opposition from the families and so forth. So there was some of that. Whether Central Asia is a special case in terms of studying intermarriage, I think so, and that's why I chose it. I think that partly the reason why I decided to look at intermarriage in this context rather than say, in Estonia or somewhere, is partly because, well, first of all, there are lots of different nationalities in Central Asia, especially Kazakhstan. I don't really agree with your portrayal of, especially Kazakhstan is a place with not as much mobility. There was a lot of mobility. People were constantly being poured in there. They were either deported there, they were exiled there, they were in the Gulag, they were in the Virgin Lands campaign. There were lots of mixed villages, So there was a lot of opportunity for mixing there and a lot of different nationalities. But I think Central Asia is a special case because it is the part of the Soviet Union that we might have, that people have regarded as being kind of, a colony initially, the way it was, conquered as part of the, in the imperial period, in the way it was related to, the cultural differences are perceived as being larger between, say, the metropole and, the indigenous culture, and so therefore there's sort of a different, there's more opportunity to look at different kinds of difference being overcome, in whether it's cultural difference, religious difference, racial difference, even urban-rural difference. So there are lots of different, there are lots of different ways of looking at intermarriage in the region. So I think, but the ones that attracted the most attention from Soviet scholars were precisely intermarriages of so-called Europeans to so-called Muslims. So those were the ones that attracted them. I don't know if that answers your question, but
it's very interesting. So Europeans, this is from sociological studies of the 70s, of the Soviet scholars. They define these Russians as Europeans.
In some cases, yes. Well, not from sociological studies, but this is the way people in the region, interviewees would talk about. And Europeans, interestingly, could be defined in various ways. Europeans could sometimes include Armenians, Tatars, Jews, Koreans. I mean, it kind of depended on how people defined things. So, but there were, so there were different, but yes, that term was used. But in the scholarship, my recollection is it's more than, specific national Russians and so forth. And then the other question, sorry, sorry, about the gender dimensions, that most, it's true that I would say probably about 70% of my interview sample is women, and it's not for lack of trying to get more men. It's just it's not, and I don't think it's because women. First of all, only in this chapter is it children and offspring of miscarriage. For most of the people I talked to were actually people who married across ethnic lines. So, but it just was much easier to get women to agree to be interviewed, whether because of the subject matter, whether because I'm a woman, for whatever reason. It was. I mean, I did get some men, but there are more women. So in the sample. So I'm not sure about your question of whether men benefited more than women from being mixed. They may have not felt the contradictions or the tensions as much, so they may not have felt as much pressure to perform in certain ways, depending on ethnicity. I hadn't really thought about that as a question.
Well, two things. One
Yes.
is that they probably didn't have to perform as much as
Right.
the other is the Communist Party might have rewarded
Yeah, I certainly haven't heard a lot of, accounts of that, of people being rewarded for promotions and so forth. Although certainly people have said that they felt that society did, they felt sort of supported in their choice to marry, but they didn't feel that anyone was actively promoting it or rewarding them or giving them preference. People who studied elites in Central Asia have said that Central Asian party members who married Russians or other European women could, have more success in their career and so forth. I have not been able to talk to anyone who falls into that category, unfortunately. So.
Sponsorship.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for all of those great questions. So I'll just try to go through order and blast through these. So Nathaniel's, do we have to use race even though Yadris uses it? So I mean, the first part of the answer is that he does use it. Carl's written about, Shapov's use of it, and Vera Pilz also writes about how Shapov takes up, and he's talking about race and narodnost and nationalnost and plemia all at the same time. There are, I think like you mentioned, Vera, earlier, that this sort of lends itself in some cases to looking at individual sentences, because you can see how he starts the sentence with plemia and then goes to narodnost and then ends with rasa, and clearly talking about the same thing. So he is using it, and so my approach to my goal in this paper is to try to, I'm not so much starting with race as my own analytical lens through which to understand this. I was struck by the ubiquity of racial discourse in all of these terms, like I said. For example, Yadrintsev's articles, his articles in the 1870s are called Ruskaya narodnost na Vostoke, so the Russian nationality in the East. In the first paragraph launches into how we need to understand the laws of miscegenation. So he's very clearly talking about nationality in terms of racial mixing, about mixing marriages, about biological transformation that has clear causal factors that he wants to isolate. This is the point, is to try to figure out what the laws are that change people's bodies. And those include environmental factors, they include culture, as we were talking about this morning. It's this disarray. But it's clear to me, at least, that the kind of indication of it, or the proof, is in the marked bodies. So the second part of your question, are Siberians marked? Yadrintsev thinks so. And he says, everybody who goes out to Ulan-Ude and sees all of these Mongol faces is surprised to find out that these are Slavic settlers. and he goes through Yakutia and Buryatia, and it's a little bit less in Western Siberia, but he literally is mapping out the degrees of transformation that are visible and measurable, that indicate the levels of racial transformation, which also for him indicate the levels of civilization. So yes, they're physically marked, and the physical marking is a means to the end of measuring the level of civilization in this place. And then the conclusion they come up with, based on what they find about racial change, is how are we going to then ask for what we need from the state? So that's why I say it's not that I'm looking at race as a category through which to understand Siberian regionalism. It's that they're talking about this as one of several means to appeal to the state. Marina, thank you for those questions as well. And I might add here that I may have given the impression that this was a kind of, separatist or nationalist movement, which it wasn't. It was a federalist movement. It was they called themselves autonomists and regionalists. And so they were writing this out in the open, as you said, right? They're talking very openly about Siberian distinction and how it's a colony. And imperial officials in St. Petersburg are, in some cases, literally begging them to write more about, tell us, like, these scathing critiques of how the empire has failed. And these imperial officials in St. Petersburg are dying for this information because of a general lack of informants, a lack of people who are out in Siberia. So it's just simply a demographic, from the perspective of the center, this vacuum, what's going on in Siberia. And here come these activists. And they kind of look the other way when there are discussions that I find in the archives of these newspapers, and the local governors are writing to the censorship administration in St. Petersburg and saying, shut down this newspaper, they're undermining my authority. And the censor in St. Petersburg writes to the Minister of Internal Affairs and say, what should we do about these troublesome, regionalists who are pissing everybody off? And the Minister of Internal Affairs writes back and says, you've got to leave it open because it's the only newspaper for 1,000 square miles. It's too valuable. And so they literally, and sometimes are, so they're not literally begging, but they're almost begging for them to generate more information. And we'll sift out the destructive stuff through our censorship mechanisms. That's why we have a government, is we can kind of protect ourselves against that. And after all, they're far away. So, there's always that kind of buffer. But they need to keep producing information, and we'll get the useful stuff, and we'll filter out the harmful stuff. So basically, the governors just had to kind of do it. So they are federalists, and they're imagining regional autonomy and talking very openly about it because of this federalist tradition in Russian political thought, that you could speak about differentiated administration in the empire, as you know. And that's what they're drawing on. All the way until the end, all the way until 1917, until they sort of have to declare sovereignty, and they establish a sovereign Siberian Republic in 1918 to try to, as I said before, try to save Russians. But that leads into the second question about why in 1905, right when race thinking and race discourse is, and study of race is becoming more widespread in the empire, and you would think, oh, this is the opportunity. Let's be a race. Let's be a nationality, and they do the exact opposite. And I think it's partly because of this federalism. So in Siberia in 1905, and mostly in response to the changes that happened after the revolution, national political movements get more leeway to open newspapers and open schools that are in local languages. And that happens in Siberia as well. So there are these Buryats that open new schools, and Yakuts that open new schools. And so these Siberian regionalists, who see themselves as the kind of godfathers of this whole region, they fall back onto this federalist vision and they say, okay, I mean, this is how I read it. They're calculating. what's the cost of pushing on this, we're distinct from everyone else? Well, we're gonna lose the Buryats and the Yakuts, and we don't wanna do that. So let's kind of transcend these national politics and these hardening politics, which everywhere are hardening. And let's be a supra, right? Like a Rossianin. It's sort of like Rossianin to Ruski, the Siberiak is to the Buryat.
Let's be an empire for Siberia.
Exactly. And in the Civil War, they haven't had a chance to do that. And Omsk becomes this new imperial center. So I think that they're very savvy that way. And I see them like, explicitly reading these local politics. Because again, their large goal that runs through all of these negotiations and strategies is that they want Siberia to be an autonomous and coherent unit, which it isn't. So they're inventing that along the way. There's, and one of the ways they need to invent that is by imagining a federalist Siberia in which all of these inarodzi can coexist with the Siberians and with the new Russian settlers.
Just wanted to interject something from, so Brazil abolishes slavery in 1888, 1889, the first 60-some years after independence are their empire, monarchy, and then they have a republic starting in 1889 that's highly federalized. But what is interesting is with the book I brought, The Invention of the Brazilian Northeast, is one of the things he's arguing is that because the northeastern states are all relatively small and weak, the one way they can kind of it can become a power within the federation is by creating a regional identity that becomes so that they're not only being thought of as the Northeast, but they're creating themselves as the Northeast and have more leverage within the Brazilian Union. But of course, then they get racialized by other Brazilians. So they are not constructing the Nordeste as necessarily as a racialized identity, but other Brazilians are racializing that identity. So there was, a lot of different ways that federalism, but federalism is one of the crucial aspects of this period.
Yeah, I think the same is the case in Russia. And it's partly this imperial legacy, it's partly an explicitly federalist legacy where it's not difficult for people in Russia, in Brazil, in Southeast Europe, Habsburg Empire, to think of a polity that's differentiated in a variety of ways. So this is the context in which they're thinking, and it enables certain imaginations, right? Certain ways of, they can go to the Minister of Internal Affairs and say, we want an autonomous Siberia. And it's not seditious. This isn't separatism. So that's, I think, the other thing that changes in 1905 that runs parallel to the increasing nationalist discourses that are hardening in certain places is that political parties become more important players, especially with elections and so forth, especially after the first Duma, right? It becomes more important to be connected to a political party which transcends these particularist divisions, and the Siberian regionalists aren't. So they're trying to navigate between, on one hand, the increasing importance of party politics and the increasing importance of national politics, and they opt to transcend. It doesn't work. I mean, it was sort of in some ways a strategic mistake, but that was their response. And then just really quickly to Cheyenne,'s question about the gendered aspect to it. I mean, it absolutely is a central part of the story, is that the assumption is that Russian or Slavic men are marrying indigenous women. And that is a basic assumption. What changes for Yadrin and the people before, what changes after the resettlement campaigns ramp up in the 1890s, and especially with the 1900s, is that you do have households moving. But that wasn't the case before. So you have, and that's a big shift in terms of the gendered aspect of this, because you can, and this is part of what I'm arguing Platonin's reacting against, because all of a sudden now this formula for how Siberians are coming into existence through intermarriage no longer works, because you have whole Russian and Slavic households moving, and so they have to reconceive what is it that distinguishes us. Because if this keeps going at the rate it's going, 600,000 people a year, 200,000 people the next year, and so on, this Siberian that we've worked so hard to define and distinguish is going to evaporate because you have too many Russians that have Russian wives. So it messes up their formula. That's my
Yeah, but one before.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, yeah, coming back to an earlier discussion that we had about mixed marriage and Central Asia, I will see to some extent, not completely clear. I think what would be potentially productive would be to look at sort of like immigrant communities.
Look at, sorry, what?
Immigrant communities and marriage, how they think about marriage.
Immigrant communities where?
Just generally. And also the history of Jewish marriage in 19th century Europe, because often what the scholars have shown is that minority groups and minority groups are often more concerned about intermarriage than majority or dominated ethnic groups. So there might be something to it that's but I would also like to come back to the question of gender. So when you were saying that especially women were concerned that they're not becoming properly included in the new kind of nationality, national identity, I wonder to what extent that has something to do with the connection between ethnic labor and national identity. Because often cultural traditions are still considered to be passed on in the through food, through education, through rearing children. So I'm guessing that's in your chapter on gender. But I'd just like to hear a little bit about that. And then finally, it's more common than I think refers to your research, but I think it could be interesting for all of us to think about when we talk about race thinking and notion of racialization as they work in the Soviet Union. I think it's fairly clear that they are at play. That nationality policies are working very, very similar registers. Except for when there is an interethnic marriage and the children have to choose, can't choose, and you can't choose your race. So I'm wondering what that does to our
Brazilians would disagree.
Okay, I'd like to hear about that. But I wonder what that does for our thinking with race, about race.
You mean that they can't choose their race? You mean what they're choosing is explicitly called a nationality in the Soviet context? Is that what you mean, or what?
No, that if there's a child coming out of an interethnic marriage, and they can choose their nationality. And a lot of Jewish children, for example, did choose the non-Jewish nationality because it would open up different possibilities for them. But in racist logic, you cannot choose your race.
Oh, I see. You mean racist logic.
There's a discount.
We're here. Let's use the question 15 minutes left if we can. Yes.
Well, I've got a related question. So I was wondering about Soviet, late Soviet, let's say Kazakh Soviet, Kazakh Russian marriage. Were those children considered as, marriages considered as producing women Kazakhs, Russians, or were Soviets? Just as biology, Siberian, right? So precisely this is one question, kind of reciprocates with the previous question, in terms of how strong was this racial component with the idea and the category of Soviet and Siberian as well. So I'm wondering, because it's kind of overlapping umbrella, right, for these children coming from these intermixed marriages. And where is race here? Because we know Soviet nationality, right? It's an official category which is adopted. Was it, so to speak, encouraged in terms of, getting rid of this breed of Soviet nationality? And intermixed marriage is encouraged in terms of getting new generation of Soviet nation, Soviet people. Just as by analogy with this Siberian nationality, Siberian nation, right? With Russians than the original Russians. So I was wondering how strong was the racial component in this discourse of Siberian and Soviet Russia.
So I think this may end up being an empirical question, and I'd like to tell you how I was thinking of it as you were talking. I really like the emphasis on this sort of lament over the sort of degraded quality of the Russian contribution to this Siberian mix. And you mentioned the sources of that a couple of times. And it's clear that it has to do, among other things, with who was moving there, right? Which includes prisoners. And so I'm trying to think about the demography and how it is that the organizations of labor in Siberia at the time make this case what it is. And so as you were talking about the word colony, I also started to recall that the current usage when people say Colonia, they often mean Женская Colonia, Colonia Strogo Regima. So Colonia, I mean, there's a certain way in which this prison system of organization of labor is part of how, this is part of the mythology of Siberia, but it's also part of the real organizations of labor. And I'm thinking also, I don't know if you mentioned it in your paper, but I think is it Topos, when she takes us with Chekhov on his trip to go see the prisons in Siberia, and he notices how everything's kind of disorganized, and it's sort of the anti-panopticon, and everyone is diffuse, and you can't figure out where authority is. And it's the prisoners who are making the families and sort of taking, setting up house, and then the bureaucrats are kind of trying to keep separate from everybody. And so I was wondering if you could say more about how, not just how prison labor mattered in this colonial situation, but how prison labor concatenated with other forms of resource extraction in the region, and how it mattered to thinking about governmentality in the region. Because I came to this as, say, a scholar of Indonesia, I might think, oh yeah, Ann Stoller and bureaucrats who keep concubines, and so it's bureaucrats who are making these mixed marriages. But I think you put your finger on something else that's also perhaps unique about this way in which this colony is a distinct kind of a periphery in a different way. So you've got, yes, prison labor in Australia, prison labor in the US. It's not unique to Russia, and yet there are all these other ways that it might be, and I'm just not sure how, okay, so is that, this demography of the prison system, how does that work here really? Or am I, have I read too much Pasternak?
Wait and let you decide how you want to respond.
So I had some thoughts about mixing and how, so sort of like the point of the show promotion of mixed marriage is to kind of create this story person who kind of said isn't able to claim a certain nationality. And then that person, even if they sort of feel copy Russian and speak Russian, I kind of assume that you spoke to Russian speakers rather than
Mainly because some of the interviews in Tajikistan were actually done in Tajik by my graduate student who's a history assistant, but those were mostly not marriages with Russians, those were marriages, yeah, exactly. So in Kazakhstan, the people who were intermarried families almost always speak Russian.
yeah. So you can speak so much as you like to have like components of nationality, it's like your parents, but then you cross it also what you look like, and the language within the language fit in ways. And so it's sort of like your people can't change their nationality, even despite their location or their culture. And they're kind of stuck with one. Whereas these people can change. And they can change without having children as well, right? They become Siberian, or they meet Siberia. And you have like, your mixing is both like social and sexual, I suppose, and like even like you don't wonder if, because sometimes I'm thinking about like the time and fact of how it takes to produce like a new generation. Certain people will persevere, that it actually takes like a while for those people to really choose their nationality. So is there something in the sexual contact itself in David's case that like makes them Siberian without even like producing the child? I don't know. Is that like a too complicated question that you're supposed to know like to answer? But then how?
There's a chapter on that.
Oh, yeah. So then it's just it's like
like, if we talk about race as an age, I mean, your people are creating one, and your people are not creating one. So I wonder if actually, like, there seems to be like a stronger sense of like permanency, whereas in the Soviet case, even though they fight it and done it in an imperial case, which is like, I'm not sure here. That's just my thought, sort of like, when can it change and when can it not change? What are the components that change?
If meaning nationality or
I
race
mean,
or.
I don't know, because my nationality was like, and I was thinking perhaps like, there was a moment when I was really looking for it, and I was like, is this about race, or is it seems to be a similar thing with like certain that claim like, oh, when you were talking about how in the process here, the nationalities claim this sort of long memorial history, which I kind of recognize, like, I kind of get realize that happened, but it sort of sounds more like conservative. It doesn't, I don't know, it's like not necessarily racial, but it could be just a very strong.
Harry.
Well, just a brief comment to just encourage the highlighting, as you are doing right in the last 20 minutes, the specificity of the Russian imperial context. Because for a French historian, this all feels very strange. And that Jan Stoller story, because the concern and the angst and debate about mixed marriage and mixité in the French context of empire is all about losing Frenchness when women marry outside of France. And until 1927, they lose their citizenship and their children can't be French. And the French are desperately trying to get more French people to fight the Germans and many other reasons and keep Frenchness going in some way. So they changed the law, and so when women marry Italians or Vietnamese or Algerians, their children are French, that problem is solved in a certain way. And it's particularly important because it's widely assumed that women are the carriers of French culture and men are not very good at it. So that's one problem. The other problem is when many, many men in the empire produce children, usually out of wedlock, and abandon them, what happens to their children? Well, for a long time, the children are sort of left. But the French figure out these could be French too. And so then they develop, again in the 1920s, a legal basis for, under certain circumstances, making the children, the bastard children of French men, French. It's particularly important in Indochina and so on. Algeria is a special case. But all of this is around citizenship and keeping people who are the products of or participants in mixed marriages connected to this. The word citizenship hasn't come up at all in this context, and it's all about the capacity of the state to make claims on people for conscription and taxes, etc., etc. So this doesn't have any particular implication for your arguments, but only to really emphasize how important the special nature of this empire is and bringing that out. And Brazil is in, the Brazilian case doesn't, is so useful for the Russian case because it is also, citizenship I assume isn't an issue either because it's all within the territory. But the issue of citizenship and the state's needs in this context don't get highlighted if you don't think about the comparison with the British and the French, where that comes out. That's just a landscape comment.
Adrienne, did you have an addition?
Yeah, I wanted to speak both to Harry but also to Betty's question. So I take Betty's question to relate to this one, which is categories. Can you make a new one? You know, what kind of category can you make in this Russian sovereignty regime? And we can think about a sovereignty regime in the imperial period. We can think about a sovereignty regime in the Soviet period, and the question of citizenship is relevant here. So no citizenship in the imperial period. But so Dave's paper and this wonderful presentation and this discussion, I think this brings us to the fore. the Siberian activists trying to create essentially a new category of Siberian. Can you do? Well, the imperial regime was like to rule through categories. Yanni brought this out earlier. Status, the state status was a category. Territory was too, function was, lots of categories. But they like to limit them. And so that idea that you could, Paul Ward's work shows us very well, that you can't just create a religious sect. I mean, the state really wants to keep control of its categories. And so, you know, it's really tough to create a new one and stick it into the regime. And there will be a lot of vested interest against that. But I think this issue of whether you have official state-defined categories and what they are, and does help us highlight the special quality of race in the Russian Empire. Because even if you take something like a state in the imperial period, people had a mistake, right? But as many, as Elise Wirtschafter has argued and so on, it wasn't static. You could move, individuals could change their estate status. I mean, they could earn the right to not be a peasant anymore and to be somebody else. They could enter into the nobility through various rules. You could climb the ladder of the state. But when it comes to race, we see something that seems much more blocked. Even though we can argue about what it means, it's much more blocked, as particularly if you move to the Soviet period, where it's not a ladder. I mean, first of all, many of the papers have made it pretty clear that one of the major differences is it isn't about hierarchy and thinking in the imperial period or the Soviet period. The nationality is not really, there's a lot of effort going into avoiding hierarchies, although many people are using it. But it's simply not a strict racial hierarchy. It's not really a ladder that you can work with. And that sort of freezing of race and its impossibility to be mobilized in particular political circumstances, I think is part of the question here. And I think, or part of what we're getting at, and why race looks so interesting, because it does highlight things that even though the state is using nationality or ethnicity in very specific ways and has rules about it, there is some racial component where you cannot choose. You've got to use the rules for your nationality, but you can't use it as a ladder the way the estate system worked, or the way perhaps even certain kinds of functional status worked and so forth.
I guess I'll be very brief, and you'll probably have much more. I just want to say two things quickly, because I made the comment about in Brazil they wouldn't say you can't choose your race, which, I mean, is absolutely, I wasn't being at all facetious. I think, first of all, what Adrienne's paper makes clear is you can't choose your nationality. It's clearly, for some people, the Russian nationality is impossible, because they see themselves as immediately becoming a target of mockery if they choose to be. So the nationality is not something you can always choose. Sometimes you can, but sometimes you can't. But I think it's very crucial when we talk about race as having innate qualities. We're not talking about individuals, we're talking about a category. The category, individuals can move in and out of that category. They don't have the innate qualities until they are fixed in that category. And in Brazil, certainly in an earlier period, over a lifetime, we can see individuals whose racial category, when they used to record racial categories and everything, racial categories changed. But in addition, almost any Brazilian I talk to will say that within limits, racial identity is partly about performance. How you present yourself, your body, how you present your care of your body, how you dress, how you do your hair, who you are friends with, and so on. So that doesn't mean that this is all. Then there's no race. But of course there's race, and race has very clear characteristics attached to it. But the individual can move in and out of those categories. So that's the point I'm making, not that, because I think it's still about innate characteristics, but not the individual, the category.
But we're technically out of time, but I would propose that you each take 5 minutes to address what you feel like you can and want to address, and then we'll officially close the proceedings and you can carry on conversations. So we already have to.
Is that okay with you guys? I could take 1 minute. I mean, I'm continue, because there were a lot of questions, there's just, I don't think there's any way we can address them all, just in response to Annika, yes, I think that the minority groups, that is a phenomenon in the Soviet Union, that minority groups, groups that are minorities within the Soviet Union as a whole, not necessarily those that are minorities within a specific republic, but I think non-Russian groups tend to be more opposed to interethnic marriage, partly perhaps because they feel the need to kind of, make their nations, build their nations, consolidate their nations, and they feel that intermarriage undermines that. I think there's an aspect to that. And as far as women feeling kind of the angst of being offspring of mixed marriages or being in mixed marriages, or feeling more pressure, because it absolutely has to do with, the labor of raising children, making food. All of these things are, have important implications for making nations and for promoting and passing along national culture, and therefore, one of the things in the gender chapter, and I'll only mention this, that I'm writing, is that so Russian women, what is very common, the most common form of marriage of Russians and Central Asians was for Russian women to marry Central Asian men. So 99 out of 100 cases, that's what was going on. And in many cases, the Russian women really felt that they had to prove themselves, prove that they were worthy of marrying into this family by showing that they could perform the food, the language, the wearing the correct clothing, the proper forms of honorific and respect for elderly people, showing hospitality to guests, all sorts of things like that, showing proper modesty expected of women in the culture and so forth. So I think it has a lot to, I think that the gender is very important in this. I won't say anything about you can't choose your race, but you can choose your nationality, because I think Barbara already said that was. And as far as Kazakh Russian marriages, I think the official kind of policy and statement on kind of Soviet policy on intermarriages is that they are good. They are promoting the eventual emergence of the Soviet people. At the same time, I think there was some expectation that among, say, officialdom and ethnographers and so forth, that in a Russian-Kazakh marriage, there would be a tendency to assimilate to the Russian side, that this was going to help create more Russians or more Russian speakers at least. That was actually often not the case, especially in villages. Especially in many cases, it was not the case, but I think there was an and it goes along with this kind of conflation of Soviet and Russian that I talk about in my book. That's all I want to say for that time.
So to Betty's question about becoming Siberia without procreating, or it goes even farther than that, because Yatnitsin has this great line where he reports that in such and such a province, the Russians who are settling in that region are so backward that they're turning into Buryats, even though they're not living near Buryats. So that even physical proximity, you don't even have to have sex to not procreate, or to become a new race, right? You can become, and this is measured in physical manifestations in the body. So this is back to your question, Nathaniel, how is this racial when they're not even not only are they not having kids, they're not even having sex. They're not even living together. But this shows up, it's because of this unproblematic idea that environment and the fact that they're eating a lot of fish that they didn't eat in Moscow, and the weather and all this stuff all changes the body. So it's racial in that sense. And then to Elena's very useful comments and questions, and about the kind of prison colony, they absolutely are using that term, and that's one of the senses in which they think about Siberia as a colony. Some historians have looked at tried to measure the actual social impact of the exile system, and have argued, well, it's overblown. There really weren't, in some cities where people were crying foul that like Adrienne said, that exiles are ruining our society. It was like, 1 out of 80 residents were prisoners. So it was, it had probably less of an impact, and however you want to measure that in reality. But the fact of the matter is that it always had a huge impact in the minds of the people who were crying about it and saying, this is a huge problem. In fact, and I'll just end with this, to the question of the bureaucracy related to the prisoners. When Yadrinsev gets exiled out of Siberia, of course, for trying to declare Siberian independence, so they send him to Archangel, which is in the northwest. He arrives, and the governor of this region immediately employs him to study and produce a report for the government on what? On the ill effects of the exile population on local inhabitants. So, and he writes this scathing, 700-page report about how these exiles are ruining the sort of lifeblood of these local communities. And of course, he's one of them, but he's accepted because he's enlightened and all of that. But so there was a very different relationship between the exiles. And not all exiles were doing that, but he wasn't the only one. Exiles in Siberia were hot commodities for local administrators because they were the political exiles, because they knew how to read and write, and so they were very useful. So this definitely is an important aspect.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.